I'm a business professor here at Leeds School of Business. I don't think that's why I'm here in the room today. It probably has more to do with the fact that before coming to Boulder, I was in the Army for 24 years. 12 of that was with JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, which is also known as our Counterterrorism Joint Task Force, or JTF. In that capacity, for the last 10 years I was there at JSOC, I served in the tactical special mission units conducting counterterrorism operations really around the world, to include tactical operations of Singleton up to an 800-plus man task force that deployed after September 11, 2012 in response to the events in Benghazi. I also worked for the Deputy Director of Special Operations in Washington, D.C. That was a strategic view of counterterrorism during 2010 to 2012 timeframe. So I have a little bit of background in counterterrorism from the tactical to the strategic sense. But I am very, very excited to introduce our panel, who has a very diverse background and experiences, and I'm fascinated to see where the discussion is going to go. So as far as an agenda for today, I'm going to do a quick introduction of our panel. For more detailed information about their backgrounds, which are quite lengthy, I would encourage you to look at your CWA either application or the magazine that has more details about what they've done in their life to date. Then I'm going to turn it over to the panel. I'm going to let each of the panel members talk for 5 to 10 minutes, their thoughts about international terrorism and where it's going. Then I'll allow the panel to respond to each other's comments and talk amongst themselves. But the majority of the time, about the last 30 to 40 minutes of today's sessions, will be the panel responding to your questions. Now, when it comes to the questions, if you have the CWA app, they asked me to read this statement, so just bear with me. But in this CWA session, we will utilize both the CWA app and a note card system to receive questions from the audience. To ask a question in the app, simply select this session in the schedule, tap Q&A, and then insert and send your question. You may also raise your hand to request a note card and a pencil from one of our producers, and they're wandering around in the back. You must write legibly. If you're a student, please note this in your question. Make your questions brief and to the point. Thank you. Now the good part, our panelists. I'm going to start with Miss Malou Innocent. So Malou is an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. The Cato Institute is a public policy research organization dedicated to the principles of individual liberty, limited government, free markets, and peace. She lives in Philly, but I know she's a transient Washingtonian. Yeah. Is that the right? She's also an active tweeter, so if you're interested in foreign policy or international relations, I recommend you follow Malou on Twitter. And sorry, I don't tweet. She'll also tweet about whatever strikes her fancy, I think. Next, we have Mr. Joe Cirincione. Yeah. Did I get it right? I've been practicing that for about an hour. Mr. Cirincione is the president of the Plowshare Fund, a global security foundation focused on eliminating nuclear weapons. He's also the author of several books, including Bomb Scare, The History and Future of Nuclear Weapons, and Deadly Arsenals, Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Threats. It's great spring break, lighthearted reading.
They're romance novels.
Yeah. But he's got a varied background that ranges from advocating for a diplomatic solution to the stalemate of the Iranian nuclear program. He's also appeared on the Colbert Report, which I think is pretty cool.
That's right.
Next up, we have Ms. Heather Ruff. Heather is a buff, so you can clap for Heather being a buff.
Oh, a buff!
And she's a research scientist at DeepMind, a leading artificial intelligence company. She's also a fellow in the New America's Cybersecurity Initiative, and her research interests pertain to international ethics, security, and emerging military technologies, particularly cyber warfare, lethal autonomous weapons, and unmanned systems. She's also interested in the responsibility to protect doctrine, international humanitarian law, and the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And then last but not least, Ambassador Ross Wilson. Ambassador Wilson is a career Foreign Service officer and the former ambassador to both Turkey and the Republic of Azerbaijan. He currently teaches at George Washington University. His service has taken him all over the world, including Moscow, Prague, and Melbourne, Australia. And I got to imagine there's quite a difference between Moscow and Melbourne. Also of note, his wife Margot is also a career diplomat. And in 2005, Ambassador Wilson earned the President's Meritorious Service Award. So please give a round of applause to our distinguished panelists. At this time, I'll turn the floor over to Malou for her opening comments.
Great. Thank you very much, Aaron. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. The United Nations and the United States have argued that the threat of cyber warfare is greater than the danger of terrorism. I'm going to make the argument that those two threats may have merged into state-sponsored cyber terrorism. First, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what it is not, and what we still don't know. Second, I'm going to lay out some of the limits of crafting a creative, effective, and coherent domestic and international policy to address this threat. So let's start with the definitions. There are none. It's a relatively new phenomenon with no definitive agreement on terms for categorizing malicious cyber activities. They're also called cyber attacks. They're also called cyber incidents. They're also called cyber threats. Lack of clarity in itself is leading to alarmism in the media and in mainstream policy debates. NPR described the recent Atlanta ransomware incident as, quote, an American city under attack. The head of the Information Systems Agency at the DoD warned the media of a looming terabyte of death. And former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta sketched a, quote, cyber Pearl Harbor scenario of state and non-state adversaries derailing passenger trains loaded with lethal chemicals, contaminating water supplies, and shutting down the power grid. And senior officials and policy experts, they often equate the threat posed by non-state criminals and terrorists, such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, with state actors, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. So there's this blending where we didn't see this before in terrorism, where terrorism was simply the act of non-state actors acting for political goals using asymmetric means versus state actors. These two have now blended. And for obvious reasons, given the fact that this is a new phenomenon, we may see the evolution of these definitions, but for right now, it is very murky. So despite the lack of consensus, I think we can glean some insights into what this all means if you look at the U.S. intelligence community's 2018 assessment of global threats and also the academic research community, and distill sort of what the state-sponsored cyber terrorism might mean. It would be politically motivated disruption of computers and networks to intimidate or harm non-combatant targets. Again, this is a low-cost, asymmetric tool similar to state-sponsored terrorism, such as Iran with Hezbollah, or maybe Pakistan with the Taliban. Except, and as I was saying to Heather earlier before we started, it's not exactly war, and it's not exactly terror. It's something in between. And this is sort of the interesting paradox to this, is that it creates new opportunities to sow fear and chaos through crime or espionage, subversion, and through sabotage. But it may not necessarily create more vectors of violence or be as destructive enough to constitute war, right up to the point of war, but not exactly breaching that line or crossing that threshold. Of course, one of the issues is that in order to cause major harm and cross that threshold toward war, it requires a great deal of engineering skills and target intelligence, and those with the capability don't have the intent, and those with the intent don't have the capability. So there are many paradoxes with this. You know, some recent cyber threats, quote unquote, Russia, its cyber doctrine is targeted disinformation campaigns to exploit Western neuroses with hackers and bots. The best way to describe it. China has a cyber espionage and cyber attack doctrine against, and it uses it against U.S. defense contractors, IT and communications firms, those that support the government and its operations. In fact, in 2014, there was a hack of the Office of Personnel Management, which is basically the federal government's human resources department, and it was alleged that this attack was by China. Over 20 million federal workers, present and former, had their files hacked, their social security numbers, their addresses, 5.6 million fingerprints were taken. You can change a social security number, you can change an address, you can't really change your fingerprint. So the government can't protect itself, at least at that moment. Then, of course, you have North Korea. It has a hacker army, which is a branch of the Workers' Party formed by Kim Jong-il and was expanded under his son, Kim Jong-un, to raise funds and gather intelligence. Our intelligence community points to the 2017 WannaCry ransomware attack as originated from North Korea, as well as the attack against Sony Pictures Entertainment. So, can a doctrine be applied to state and non-state actors simultaneously? What metrics would constitute a major cyber incident? And how do we define the rules of engagement? these are all questions that are still being sorted out, and I think will need to be sorted out before we develop really coherent and effective policies. And given the sort of questions and the confusion around cyber conflict, this leads to the second part of my talk, and that there are certain limits to crafting what would be a creative and coherent domestic and international policies to address this threat. So currently there are various domestic, federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies that have roles and responsibilities and activities to counter these threats. The DHS uses big data analytics to track and target high-value individuals. The FBI has a database of artificial intelligence for facial recognition, as well as other things. The CIA uses robotic drones. That's gotten a lot of attention since 9/11. The DoD has Cyber Command on par with Southern Command and Central Command that reports directly to the Secretary of Defense. The NSA, as we know, remains the head cryptology agency within the federal government. And of course, the Secret Service also has agents and staff embedded at almost every level of the federal government, whether that be Treasury, DEA, Justice Department. And I guess what I'm getting at here is that there is a lot, in fact, like the lead up to 9/11, a fragmented interagency process that creates a great deal of noise and will require a great deal of coordination amongst the information sharing of those various agencies. There's going to be a competition for budget resources and also confusion over top-line government priorities. Now, President Trump, I know there's another panel just across the way on President Trump's foreign policy, but at least on cybersecurity, he said that America should have, quote unquote, unquestioned dominance in the cyber realm, of course. The low-end estimate of what we spend currently, because a lot of this is classified, is around $28 billion on cybersecurity spending. Again, there are questions. These spending figures are classified, so it's hard for taxpayers to know exactly where federal tax dollars are going, how it's being spent, why it's being spent, and what's working and what's not working. And we also must keep in mind that will the U.S. always retain its lead in cyberspace? How will the U.S. respond if and when a great power like China gains a decisive advantage? And will the new security environment see a contraction of U.S. global influence? This gets to the importance of creating international institutions to build cooperation to mitigate the threats of cyber attacks. I know Heather's going to get to this as well in her remarks. That in August 2017, in fact, 116 founders of robotics and AI companies from 26 countries signed an open letter asking the United Nations to, quote, urgently address the challenge of lethal autonomous weapons because they can be weapons of terror and open up a Pandora's box. In September 2015, there is a bilateral U.S.-China cyber commitments agreement against cyber theft and intellectual property. And in 2011, China and Russia proposed at the United Nations an international code of conduct for information security. Now, the United States rejected this offer, and I think there's also a question of whether China and Russia would have used these tactics to crack down on internal dissidents. There's also the issue of how do you get non-state actors who may be a source of threat also involved in these international groups. But I think it certainly is worth pursuing, and given the Wild West nature of where we are with this threat, I think it's better to pursue the realm of cooperation in order to mitigate potential threats. But I think something interesting has also happened after 9/11 in the sense that the global war on terrorism, we've seen a sustained deviation away from the UN Charter and the Geneva Conventions. We've seen increased U.S. unilateralism, regime change, detention, and interrogation. So can we reconstitute a rule-bound international order in the digital realm, given what we've done in the more conventional terrorist realm? Has the global war on terror reduced the incentive to cooperate with the United States and institutionalize norms? In closing, I'll say that state-sponsored cyber terrorism remains unclear with many conceptual uncertainties, which in turn limits domestic international policies that serve a clear strategic purpose. In terms of recommendations, I have many, in case you couldn't tell. We talk a lot about border security. The border must build the wall, build the wall. Well, build the right walls. We need more robust defense. There's this focus, I think, on offensive cyber policies and not so much on the defense, whether that be banking, whether that be health, whether that be transportation, whether that be communications. The ease with which our facilities and our intelligence could be targeted, I think, points to the fact that we need more robust defense and not so much focus only on offense. It may not deter an aggressor, but certainly it'll make the idea and the ability to extract that information much more difficult. In fact, last year, Atlanta had an audit, and they found that its cyber security was desperately weak. So we can see that in terms of cities around the country, probably in the same state as Atlanta. We should also have some perspective. I don't want to be completely dystopian, but we should also remember that the internet has enabled us to be vastly more sophisticated and knowledgeable about the world than we ever have before, even arguably than we were 5 or 10 years ago. It's been a tool for emancipation. It's been used as a tool for cyber activism and the spread of culture and knowledge. And through the digital space, I would hate to see more government crackdowns on what the internet is supposed to be, which is an open forum for the open exchange of ideas. And I think we should also be aware of expanded and invasive domestic surveillance, this omniscient surveillance that we've tried to have with the keeping of online records and transactions, internet browsing, and digital messaging history that impacts due process, civil liberties, and domestic tranquility. And I think finally what we need is a more informed citizenry, one that is willing to push back against very powerful political and bureaucratic incentives in Washington that seek to hype the threat as well. We should be more knowledgeable about it and have precautions, be aware of it, but don't be overpowered by the hysteria about it. I think what we've learned, at least since 9/11, as my colleagues and I at Cato have said many, many times, if we've learned anything since 9/11, is that we should have learned that when we overact terrorism, all we end up doing is terrorizing ourselves. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Malou and Joe.
That was fabulous. That was just great. I'm delighted to be back here for what is at least my 10th Conference on World Affairs event. I've lost track, actually. It may be 12. And that's not just because I'm getting old. It's these events are so jam-packed. They're so filled with interesting conversations and interesting people, and the level of on the panels of collegial competition is so high. I mean, how am I supposed to compete with that? I mean, seriously. Oh, wait, and Heather is talking next, and she's going to talk about killer robots. I mean, come on. If you're listening to this on a podcast, you can just skip ahead 8 minutes and get to the really interesting stuff that's about to happen. But first, we're going to talk about nuclear terrorism. Oh, okay. Maybe you'll stick around for this part. And there's a little bit of good news on the international terrorism front. Since 9/11, I think our #1 national security threat has been nuclear terrorism, or what some people would call, mass destruction terrorism. The 9/11 attack was unprecedented, and terrorist groups had never killed on that scale before. Terrorists normally don't want to kill on that scale, but usually what they're doing is they're competing for political power, competing for control of a territory. Think of the Irish, IRA, for example, or the Tamil Tigers. So they don't want to kill masses of their own people that they're hoping to win over to their cause. And then we had this apocalyptic, messianic terrorism burst out in 9/11. And the obvious fear, and I was one of the many people who wrote on this, was what's next? How does a group top a 9/11 type attack? And you obviously went to how easy it would be for these groups to acquire chemical weapons, biological weapons, or the ultimate, nuclear weapons. Now, the risk of this has always been low. A terrorist group can't make a nuclear weapon from scratch. They can't make the stuff, the highly enriched uranium or the plutonium. It takes a massive industrial facility. It takes a nation to make a nuclear weapon to do that. But the fear was if they could get that material, then they could, with enough money and enough broker talent, they could assemble a crude Hiroshima-type device. That technology is over 70 years old now, and then smuggle it in. That's no problem, and then there's no shortage of suicide bombers to detonate it. So we've always been worried about that. We are less worried about that kind of attack right now. The chances were always low because it was hard to do this, but we're less worried about that. So there's a little bit of good news on the international terrorism front. It is no longer listed at in the national security strategy of the United States as the #1 threat to America, as it has been for almost 20 years now. And part of the reason is because we did things about it. Some of them were brutal things, the so-called war on terrorism, where we have smashed international terrorist networks. And I would say that the recent defeat of ISIS, at least the defeat of ISIS as a group that was controlling large amounts of territory and was in control of billions of dollars of assets, that is no longer. That ISIS no longer exists. The Democrats, Republicans, liberals, and conservatives, that war, however brutal, and we'll talk about this later, succeeded in smashing ISIS and driving it out of its control of cities. And ISIS was by far the nuclear terrorism nightmare. They had territory. They had international networks. They had the billions of dollars in assets that you would need to do something to smuggle people in and out of, say, areas of Russia where they had nuclear material. They had connections with Pakistan where they have nuclear material, and ideological compatriots who might agree with their mission on this. In fact, in a sting operation, Georgia, in the state of Georgia, undercover group caught a Russian worker at a nuclear facility who was selling highly enriched uranium to a group he thought was ISIS. That's why he was doing it. He wanted to get to strike back at America, and he thought ISIS would deliver the blow. Well, that is now a lower probability. It's not nothing. It's not that threat hasn't disappeared. It's just lower down on the scale, and there are other more serious threats that have sort of replaced it, bumped it down. You know, it's on the bestseller list. It's now like number 6 on my book for #1 threats to America. And so that's good. And the other thing we did, by the way, was a more positive effort. We went out and tried to better secure the materials that these terrorists could get. So we consolidated stockpiles of highly enriched uranium. The nuclear security summits that President Obama started actually got countries to give up stockpiles, small stockpiles that they were using for peaceful purposes. They have research reactors that are fueled by highly enriched uranium. But there was enough of that fuel or material for the fuel lying around that a terrorist group could have stolen it from Vietnam, for example, or from Ghana, or from Nigeria, or from Mexico. And a dozen countries that had this material now given it up, have shipped it out. Others have increased their security on it. So there's some positive things that we did to reduce that threat. So now we turn that page a bit. It's not off the books, but it's not at the top. And that gets me to the threat you just heard about this cyber threat. Because now you see these things merging. And the cyber threat, the way we've just been talking about it, we think of it as the ability of a terrorist to wreck a major infrastructure here. And this is a leap that the United States pioneered with the Stuxnet virus that made the leap from software, from a cyber hack that was just stealing information or monitoring activity, to one that actually took over hardware, that took over the machinery. In this case, we penetrated the Iranian nuclear program, and we took over their centrifuges. And unbeknownst to the centrifuge operators, we spun them up and slowed them down, until they crashed. And we wrecked 1,000 centrifuges that way. Never been done before. We did it. Yay, USA. Well, now what? Guess what? Everybody else says, well, I can do that too, and they can do that too. And we showed the way, and they're doing it too. And we haven't, I'm not sure if we've seen it. Maybe one of the other panelists will correct me whether we've seen that yet, but it is coming. And you just heard we talk about, well, are they going to take down a dam? Would they crash the electric grid? Would they take over a nuclear weapon? Would they take over a nuclear weapon? And this is, you want to talk about the next phase? This is one of the things you're worried about a lot. So not a terrorist group stealing the material and making a bomb, not actually stealing a bomb, no James Bond, Thunderball kind of scenario, although that's still a possibility. No. They just take control of it, and they can take control of it from anywhere. And if you think our nuclear weapons are somehow immune to hacking, you haven't been paying attention. There is no air gap that can defend you. The Iranian centrifuges were air-gapped, meaning they were disconnected from a network that was external to the facility. You can do this. In fact, there's this wonderful movie called 0 Days. I think it was Alex Gibney who did it. If you can get this on Netflix, it tells you more about cyber warfare than you thought you could learn. And one of the things they tell you, and it's the story of the Stuxnet virus, how we found out about it, what it does, and then they would disclose that that was only one of our attacks. We had another lined up to go. I think they called it Olympic Zeus. That was Olympic Zeus. And this was going to be something that was going to take over the controls of the Iranian military equipment. So when they pushed a button, nothing happened. Well, again, if we can do it, they can do it. And if you can stop a button from working when you push it, can you make a button work when you don't push it? And that's the new terrifying possibility that's out there, this conjunction of state and non-state actors working with our nuclear weapons. And for me, you know, I've been working on eliminating nuclear weapons since I found out what a nuclear weapon was. You know, this is a new frightening territory. This is yet one more reason why the fewer of these weapons we have, the safer we are. We should be all agreeing to get down to the lowest level possible. Can we eliminate them? I think we can, but for God's sakes, let's get down from 15,000 to something like a couple of hundred, that we can at least have more security and prevent this new terrifying threat on its way. Over to killer robots. Good. Okay. I built you up, Heather.
I know.
Here you go.
I know. This is really. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Joe. Thanks for everybody coming here, and I'm excited to be back at CU Boulder. As a student here, I didn't actually. I wasn't able to imbibe on a lot of the CWA events I was usually teaching. I was a graduate student here, but I'm excited to be here, and it's even crazier to be an alum and sitting here and doing this. So yes, I'm going to talk about killer robots, but I'm actually going to try to terrify you more than Joe did. In fact,
the competition in this conference.
Yeah, I'm gonna see if you're going to go home tonight and just cry. So here's what I'd like to.
She looks so nice too.
Here's what I'm going to paint a picture for you for the future of war and the future of terrorism and how they're interlinked, and they're interlinked through technology. So first, before I say anything, I have to say that I'm speaking in my own personal capacity. I do not represent DeepMind. I do not represent Google. I do not represent Alphabet or any of its subsidiary organizations. I am here just as me. So on to the terrifying things. So the killer robot debate. Let's just start right there, and then we'll paint the picture of how that feeds into the terrorist discussion on this panel. So killer robots are also known as lethal autonomous weapon systems. And an autonomous weapon system is a system that can select and engage targets without the intervention of a human operator. Now you might think to yourself, this sounds very much like a drone or a remotely piloted aircraft, an MQ-9 Reaper or a Predator. That is not what we're talking about. An MQ-9 Reaper or a Predator is piloted by a human. All targets are selected by a human, and they're vetted by a judge advocate general, JAG officer, a legal officer. There's an overseeing commander who is highly involved in all of those operations. There's lots of humans around. It's just killing at a distance. Autonomous weapon systems, however, there is no human in the loop. They select and engage targets by themselves. And they decide when and how to use force against those targets. That is something over and above what we currently have. And you might think to yourself, why on earth would we ever want to have autonomous weapon systems? And the reason we want to have them is because we have these near-peer competitor states that we've talked about earlier. So Russia and China, those states that we can't use our high-tech ballistic missiles against or our cruise missiles against, they engage in what we call A2AD, which is anti-access area denial. So if we can't get in and maneuver if we need to, or we can't defend against them, we have to figure out new technologies to counter A2AD. So here's how that works. You get a swarm of small robotics, and DARPA right now DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, is working on swarms of up to 250 robots to suppress enemy air defenses and to do all sorts of nice little things. We also have swarm boats, so you can get in and do interdiction in littoral waters. So there's all sorts of applications that we're thinking about with autonomy. I should also note that this week, right now in the United Nations in Geneva, is a group of governmental experts. It's basically the UN Convention on Conventional Weapons is considering preemptively banning autonomous weapon systems. It is increasingly unlikely that that will happen. The UN Convention on Conventional Weapons is a convention based on consensus, so all member states that sign it have to agree to whatever they come out with. There is no agreement, and the big powers want their toys. So we're debating killer robots in Geneva right now, and it's going to be a long haul. That said, okay, we can talk about autonomous weapon systems as just kind of robotic systems, or we can talk about them as systems of systems. So you can think of loitering munitions. You can think of things that, like a big C-130 airplane that drops the back down and can just kind of disperse more autonomous systems. It acts as a mothership. These are kinds of the types of concepts of operations that we're thinking about. Now, an autonomous weapon system runs on artificial intelligence, right? It needs to be able to get to where it's going. It needs to be able to identify and select and engage. It needs to have some sort of understanding of proportionality, necessity, of identifying a target to be discriminate. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe we can have stupid ones that are just really, really bad. But if we want to have them at least attempt to comply with the laws of war, which is debatable, highly debatable, they have to have some sort of smarts about them, which means that they run on information communication technology, right? Which means that they are open to being hacked, which means that if you rely heavily on high-end technology to fight your wars, you're also putting that high-end technology as a center of gravity, is what Clausewitz would call it, right? That's if you can turn your robots against yourselves, ooh, that would be pretty bad. So you're not only your enemy, but if your enemy can hack your robot army, we're in trouble. We talked about the OPM hack, which, by the way, I am a victim of. Yes, China has my fingerprints. Thank you. I love my DoD. So we talk about the OPM hack as one kind of hack. I mean, that's a big hack, but I mean, you can imagine hacking into these types of systems as really, really devastating. So how does this kind of align with the notion of terrorism? Well, we're preparing, I mean, when I say we, I mean like the United States definitely, but I would say that many modern large countries, militaries, are building these types of technologies for the future of war. And when that's true, that means that they're preparing to fight against another high-end adversary. But the reality is, if we look at the history of wars, we haven't really fought a lot of high, like near-peer wars. Right? What we've done is we've taken our high-tech technology and then we've used it against a state or a non-state actor group that is on the low end, the low-tech side of things. And so you get this asymmetry between high and low. And when you get that asymmetry between high and low and you're killing at a distance or you're killing, with a killer robot, right, you can't really hurt your enemy, right? It's really hard for Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Al-Shabaab or anything like this to really hit the United States military. I mean, they're not going to win against an F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. So what did they do? Well, they know they need to hit back, but they can't hit back at the military itself. So that breeds incentives for increased terrorism, right? Because what is the center of gravity of any Western democracy? It's people. Right, so if you want to hurt somebody, you want to hurt the United States, you want to hurt France, you want to hurt Great Britain, you want to hurt Germany, what do? You don't go after their military, you go after their people, right? And so I think there are incentives that are afoot with this push towards increased technology, increased automated killing, autonomous weapon systems, cyber systems, that what that's going to do is it's going to breed incentives for increased targets on civilians, right? You don't need, I mean, a terrorist doesn't need to hack an autonomous weapon system. Another state will do that. But a terrorist will rent a bus and mow down people because they're unhappy with the way in which the wars are being prosecuted in their areas. So think about that. The other thing I think that we know going forward, right? You know, if I put my evil genius hat on and I say, well, I want autonomous weapon systems, and I think, oh, that's increased incentives for asymmetric terrorist attacks on my people. Well, then how do I do that? How do I guard against that? Well, if you're trying to guard against that, what do? You do more surveillance, right? Increased surveillance to attempt to mitigate or preempt or prevent terrorist attacks. And in the age of information communication technologies, surveillance is really easy. Every single one of you in this room right now is shedding data. Think of that next time you walk out and you know, wherever, from your ride home to here, your ride from work to here, I'm sure your iPhone pops up and says, it's 20 minutes to the office. Mm-hmm. How the hell does my iPhone know that I'm leaving my house and headed to the office? Because we are creatures of habit. And that data profile builds up in some server someplace, and it says, oops, she's headed to the gym again. Oops, she's headed to work again. And that information is so easy to get. So thinking back to Malou's comments, you know, we have incentives for terrorism, so we have incentives for automated killing, we have incentives for terrorism, and now we have incentives, counter incentives for surveillance. And that's the data that, you know, just you get from your phone, right? We also happen to live, and this is for the students in this room, in a world of voyeuristic tendencies. Stop posting all of your pictures of what you eat on Facebook, right? Stop telling us exactly how you feel about your political opponents. You know, we talk about the right to privacy and we want our data to be private. Well, guess what? We are not living privately. And that data is so easy to scrape, and it's so easy to build a profile, to hack. You know, we call these APTs, advanced persistent threats. So all I need to do is say, oh man, there she goes again, she's headed to work, and I bet it's a Monday. She's gonna post a picture of that lovely little Thai place that she likes to go. You know, oh, yep, how do I get her? How do I hack into her systems? I'll send her a fake coupon to that Thai place with a nice little piece of malware embedded in it. So when she clicks on it, I own her systems, right? Those are the types of things that we are going to continually, we already do this, and we're going to continue to do this as a way of mitigating against terrorism, right? So we want to see more people. We want to see their faces. You know, the data set that was mentioned before by the FBI of facial recognition, you would be surprised how many of your faces are already in a data set that when you pass into the airport, bloop, bloop, you're there, right? If you look at what China's doing right now with its surveillance policies, right? The Chinese police department have started using Google Glasses, which take facial image recognition pictures, and it runs it back to a database against all the bad apples, so that the cops just have to stand around and look for and just wear the glasses and look for the criminals. You can imagine this happening more and more as fighting against terrorism. So I would say that again, you know, we already use so much of these techniques to fight terrorism. You know, when you think about operations, JSOC operations, for instance, you know, all I need to do is find your Wi-Fi signal. I need to find your phone. I need to find your network. I need to map your pattern of life. I need to map your friends' patterns of lives. I need to map your family's patterns of lives. And then I'm going to wait for you to make a mistake. And then I'm going to use a drone to put a Hellfire missile wherever you are. Now, bring that back to killer robots. What if I don't even need to be monitoring all of this, right? What if I have artificial intelligence doing this and can launch a system like that, right? That's the kind of future, that mass surveillance, autonomous systems future is what's coming. That also has many, many potential vulnerabilities in the system because it is an information communication technology running on AI. So just think about that. So terrorism is going to be more likely, surveillance is going to increase, you're helping it with, you know, Facebook pictures of your salads, and you know, I worked for Google, right? Google has a lot of information on every single one of you. Think about how you own your data. Think about how you control your data, because that vision of that future is definitely coming. And we know that we're going to need public-private partnerships with companies like Amazon or Microsoft or IBM or Google to help fight against those types of potential terrorist attacks. And finally, one more kind of quick comment before I end, maybe two. One is that, we think about, the nuclear threat as being maybe a little less on the nuclear terrorism side, but there's been reports that Russia has an autonomous submarine that likes to, patrol off of the coast of DC. And it's also rumored that such autonomous submarine is going to be capable of launching nuclear-tipped SLBMs. So think of an autonomous submarine with autonomous nuclear weapons on it, and that's really terrifying, especially if you think of all of the kind of glitches that have happened over the years that we've narrowly escaped blowing up the world multiple times over. That also comes on the heels of nuclear modernization efforts in this country, that we're trying to bring up our nuclear arsenal and our triad into the 21st century with autonomy, AI, cyber, all those types of things that are going to be linked together in these very interesting and complex ways. And yes, on the intelligence side of things, we have 17 different intelligence agencies in this country. And they do not play by the same playbook. So that also complicates matters. And, again, just to be a friendly competition to Joe.
I think you won, hands
I
down.
will correct you.
You got it.
I will correct you that Stuxnet was not supposed to actually break the nuclear reactors.
Centrifuges.
The centrifuges, sorry, yes. The centrifuges. What they were supposed to do was just speed them up and slow them down at a rate that would not allow them to enrich the uranium, but they were not supposed to be able to know it. So it was a sabotage kind of attack and they wanted to basically do this forever, right? So they would go, why is my nuclear reactor not working? Why is the uranium not going? And what happened was Stuxnet, as a cyber weapon, wasn't that great. And it malfunctioned, and it sped them up so fast and so slow that it broke them, and then they went, well, what's wrong with this? And then they went hunting for what was wrong with it, and they found out what was wrong with it. And so actually all of the years and planning and money that went into Stuxnet was not really for that much effort, all that effort for not much, right? They replaced the centrifuges right after that.
Yeah, that's right.
And then they canceled their contract with Siemens because Siemens helped with
That's
Stuxnet.
right.
We gave the game away.
We gave the game away. So that's another thing, right? Cyber weapons they're buggy, right? So think of an autonomous killer robot that's buggy, right? With nuclear weapons on it. Thank you.
Well, there's so much good news in those three presentations. I hardly know where to start. I will start by noting this is my first appearance at this conference on world affairs. It's a real treat to be here. I want to thank the organizers for making it possible for me to be with you. I'm deeply impressed by how many are in this room. It's a reminder that for millions of Americans, quite correctly, for all the reasons and many others that have been laid out here, international terrorism is still big business and should concern every single one of us in this room and everyone in this country. What I want to do is talk a little bit about a couple of the upcoming threats or the remaining threats that I think are still out there that didn't get touched on, but really spend most of my time talking about the response, the U.S. government response, and the ways in which we're making it harder for ourselves. Our country is making it harder for the United States to defend and protect itself and to ensure against terrorist attacks, successful terrorist attacks in the future. In the kind of current tense category, a couple of items that weren't mentioned. Joe noted ISIS now largely defeated, but those ISIS fighters are not all dead. A number of them are finding their ways to European countries and presumably elsewhere in the world. A number of their ranks are foreign citizens, Americans, Europeans, and others, foreign fighters, the vernacular term applied to them, and they're going to go back. You can kill people. It's harder to kill an ism. It's harder to kill that idea that they stand for and represent, and I think that's one significant piece of the ISIS piece that remains with us. I think a second one that's very much related to ISIS is that the circumstances that gave rise to this movement in the first place, especially in Syria, have not changed one iota. And Iraq is a little bit better, and there's a panel later in the week to talk about Iraq, but Syria hasn't changed at all. And just as al-Qaeda begat ISIS, those conditions may well create a circumstance in which ISIS will beget something else that at this point we can't entirely imagine. We can see and observe those conditions in Syria and should be concerned about those. Third sort of past tense set of issues, al-Qaeda. They're actually still in business. The very first attacks that took place in September, October 2014, the beginning of President Obama's campaign to degrade and ultimately destroy ISIS, if you recall that, the very first bombing runs were not against ISIS. They were against al-Qaeda in northwest Syria. Al-Qaeda remains in northwest Syria, in a pocket between Turkish forces that have intervened now in Afrin and some other parts of northwest Syria, and Syrian forces below. And we should be concerned about those folks because their goals, their objectives haven't changed a bit. The reasons we went after them in the fall of 2014 were good and legitimate reasons, having to do with what we knew they were up to, and you can be pretty sure that their plans haven't significantly changed. The sort of transition to the response, a significant share of what was discussed, especially Malo and Heather, really involved, as they noted, state actors, not just or not so much non-state actors. And I think we may be entering an era, or going back to an era, where interstate conflict is maybe a little bit more dominant or important or a little more dominant in U.S. government policymaking related to security than it has been for the last 17 years. Much more dominated by non-state actors, non-state threats to American national security, to American interests and citizens. And of course, there's somewhat different tools that governments use and that our government uses, going against a state-oriented problem as opposed to a non-state actor. We know for sure, I think, notwithstanding the good prognostication my colleagues have engaged in, that we don't know what the next threat is going, not the next threat, what the next specific problem is going to be. We didn't expect 9/11. Maybe we sort of could have, but we didn't, is the fact of the matter. We don't know what is going to come next. Our government will have to respond, as will other affected governments. And governments, in our government, sort of goes about these things in a certain way. And as I think through both the process, but it's not a process question, I think through how we do this on every front, what's been going on in American foreign policy at a minimum complicates, if not utterly compromises, our ability to proceed sensibly. So when confronted with problems, a sensible U.S. national security approach thinks about, okay, here's the problem. What's the outcome we would like to see with respect to that problem? And this can't be kind of pie-in-the-sky stuff. It has to be calculated. It has to be cold, clear-eyed, realistic about what's achievable. You have timelines, you have sequencing. You think if we want to be there in 4 years, okay, what has to happen within 3 years? What has to happen within 2 years? What has to happen within 6 months? Or not what has to happen? What are the states that we want to find ourselves in? It implies a careful, strategic statecraft, not the long suit of the U.S. government in general, and not the strongest suit of the present administration in particular. It requires some kind of stick-with-it consistency of purpose that seems to be elusive in the way that our foreign policy is currently being described by the authorities in Washington. A second set of things that our government does, thinks about the tools we have to bring about those outcomes that we want to try to achieve. Again, cold, an assessment of our tools that's cold, rational, skeptical about the ability of these tools to affect the outcomes, to influence the problem that we see, to prevent that problem or deter that problem, to destroy that problem if that's what's necessary, and to think about these tools in ways that have acceptable costs, in terms of human lives, monetary costs, damage to other interests that we may have. And here too, I think we're digging ourselves into a significant set of holes. In part because of the extreme militarization of American foreign and security policy that's taken place since 9/11. It's least of all the creation of the present administration. But that sort of blinded ourselves. We blinkered ourselves in terms of how we think about these tools in ways that's damaging. We've along these lines, somewhat provocatively, we've kind of taken off the table diplomacy. Diplomacy with Al-Qaeda or ISIS, maybe not. Diplomacy with the Taliban, maybe. We are kind of sort of engaged in that. I can't tell to what extent that work has serious support at senior levels in Washington. That's a set of tools that I strongly suspect will kind of be off the table if the time comes around. And a line that I saw attributed to John Bolton in the papers yesterday or today, I don't do carrots and sticks. Okay, there are ways to deal with problems. There are kinetic ways. There are other ways. And I strongly suspect that this administration's inclinations flow in a different direction. A third sort of set of things that you think about are partnerships. And this is the weakest area, I think, for this administration, which is digging a big hole, making our country significantly less secure. Our alliances are frayed. Our NATO allies uncertain about America's purpose, its consistency, its reliability, about America's ability to see a problem from A to B to C to D. I was struck 3 or 4 days ago, President Trump, we're going to get out of Syria. Yesterday, President Trump, Assad has to pay a price. Well, which is it? And how are our friends and allies supposed to figure that out? Partnerships in other ways important. Partnerships with countries that sometimes are somewhat odious. Turkey, where I spent a lot of my time. Egypt. Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, 2 countries that state-to-state conflict, one matter. On matters of more traditional interstate terrorism or international terrorism of the kind that's obsessed us for the last 17 years, arguably they have very similar interests. Our ability to work with them certainly is not a growth industry at present. And then a fourth thing that governments do develop strategies, tactical plans, who's going to have the lead, how is this going to work? Again, constancy of purpose, clear-headed thinking, commitment, all kind of on the downer here. And then there's the matter of who leads. And Heather referred to the 17 agencies. I could add an 18th, which is called the State Department, which is also an intelligence agency.
When it has a head.
When it has a head, yes, there is that problem. And figuring out how we organize that effort, it cannot be led by the U.S. government, by the U.S. military. But how do we do this? And it will vary depending, of course, on the problems that we have. Last two items quickly. Any sensible government has to figure out how to engage the Congress and the American public, which involves, among other things, speaking honestly and directly to them based on facts and objectively determinable information. Also, not sort of claiming successes where successes don't exist and sugarcoating a problem that is a big problem. And you don't get much of that out of the rhetoric of out of the U.S. government. It doesn't really appear very much, and at least in what I read about the Trump administration's national security policy, national security strategy, issued, I think, in January. Last, no winging it. This isn't a problem that can just be kind of done occasionally in a haphazard way through tweets. Solving problems of international terrorism dealing with this, it's not through a statement, it's not through an event, it's not through an attack. None of those things are the same thing as results. And I think a challenge that our country will have, a big challenge this administration will have, is in kind of keeping those pieces separate, keeping an eye on the ball, keeping the support of the American public, which comes back to my last point. Thank you for your interest in this topic.
Wow.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you to all our panelists. With our time remaining, we're going to jump into our questions. So there are people walking around if you want to write them down. Otherwise, I've received some through the app, and I'm going to start with a softball for all four panelists. From the view of international terrorism, are we safer now than we were 10 September 2001? And when I say we, I'd like you to comment, if you could, both we, the individual American, whether walking down Pearl Street or in Europe, and then we, the nation, the U.S., whether it's existential or near existential threat.
Wow. Let me start. Let's get on the line. This is a tough one. You know, did we win the war on terrorism? Did it work? This is real close. I would have to say no. No, we're not safer. For some of the reasons, Heather's got Heather's great phrase. Some of our activities, you know, killed the terrorists, but they bred the incentives for increased targeting of civilians. I think there's more hatred in the world against America now than there was in 9/11. Al-Qaeda was isolated then. We had the sympathy of the world in September of 2001. There was 1 million people who demonstrated in the streets of Tehran in support of America. I've got to think that the threats, we don't face that kind of powerful, organized terrorist group at this point, but there's no reason why that can't be recreated, and recreated quickly.
I would certainly argue that we have seen an exacerbation of the terrorist threat for reasons my co-panelists have mentioned. We've seen an increase in their number. We've seen an increase in their geographic dispersion. We've seen an increase in their lethality. You know, Al-Qaeda was once this small band of militants that had some connections in Europe, but mainly was centered in the Afghan-Pakistan border. Now they're in the Sahel, now they're in the Persian Gulf, now they're still on the Af-Pak border, now there are elements that are still in Europe and expanding into the United States. So, I mean, we've increased that threat. Again, though, I want to come back to the likelihood of, you know, what's the threat compared to other threats? You know, 2/3 of the people you know are going to die of one of two things: heart disease or cancer. So let's keep it in perspective as well.
Yeah, so Maybe I sit a slightly different position on this one because I don't live in the United States anymore. I live in London. And I see a different set of challenges from the European side. You know, there are far more terrorist attacks in Europe. London itself, right? There was 3 giant terrorist attacks back to back. You look at, you know, what France has had to deal with. You look at, you know, all sorts of other things popping up. So I think that in that sense, right, are we safer? You know, and you want to say that is like Western democratic values against extremism, right? And I'm not going to label what kind of extremism, because I think just saying Islamic extremism is not the way to go, because in this country, I would say we have lots of terrorist attacks. We just don't call them terrorist attacks, right? We call them mass shootings, right? And to me, like, when you have some sort of ideology behind this, be it racial or religious or something else, the whole point of that is to incite terror into some target population, whatever that target population may be. And it helps that there's no internationally defined or agreed upon definition of terrorism. So I can say, as long as you're, you know, trying to instill terror into a target population, guess what? That's terrorism. So I think, you know, our homegrown terrorists in this country, you know, that the wars against, you know, Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other things have also incentivized other types of weird behavior at home. And then I think in Europe, right, we have, at least in the United Kingdom, there is sincere worries about returning foreign fighters that have left and gone to the Middle East and they're coming back. There's a large Muslim population in Britain that is worried about, you know, them coming back and then what that does to the terrorizing of that population. So I think that in that sense, are we safer? Is this an existential threat? I think what we've done is we've created kind of such a climate of fear around terrorism that in that sense we are not safer, right? We consistently talk about it. We consistently worry about it. We put more money into it. We try to fight wars abroad. We use distance, you know, at a distance killing. We increase our surveillance. And so in that sense, it's like, are we safer? From what, right? And especially from ourselves. So in that sense, I'm not really sure that that's an easy question to answer.
Yeah, you call that a softball.
Yeah.
I'll be very brief. I think that the counterterrorism strategies the United States has carried out in the years since 9/11 have succeeded in addressing a whole range of threats and problems and in addressing the problem of terrorism. Joe referred to the work on securing nuclear materials, nuclear weapons. Was extremely important and still is. A lot of good work has also been done in the financing area that makes it harder for terrorists to get their hands on large amounts of money and move large amounts of money around, and that has narrowed the space. Has it really, is America safer today, or is the world safer today than it was on 9/11? I'd agree with my colleagues. Not obviously, including especially because the problems are now more diffuse in more parts of the world and in more countries that are even less capable of dealing with them than we or our European allies.
Okay, thank you. And we have a lot of questions, so I'm doing my best to kind of capture the themes. And the next question comes from several people all talking about the same general concept, which essentially centers around our counterterrorism efforts to date and the impacts that they've had. And this is near and dear to my heart. Some of you are very critical of America's counterterrorism efforts, and even some talking about violation of human rights and the repercussions it's having on the threat as it exists today. And the question is, what are we doing to address the underlying causes of terrorism? Are we doing enough? And how would you rate America's response versus counterterrorism, offensive to eliminate the threat versus dealing with the underlying causes of terrorism?
Let me start, and I'll be real quick because I know the least about this in the panel. I don't think I'm critical of the counterterrorism operatives. I'm not critical of of you, for example. We want you. We need you. We need those operations. It's what else we didn't do that's the problem. You know, there was no sort of, in some ways, we didn't have enough of a nation-building strategy around these. Or conversely, you might say, look, we got al-Qaeda. It succeeded in Afghanistan. If we had stopped there, but we didn't. We started a war in Iraq that fractured the Middle East, and we're dealing with this mess. It was the biggest single strategic blunder in U.S. military history. It's created a lot of it. So that's not counterterrorism. That's not ops. That's the failure of the bigger strategy. That's the failure to have, you know, sort of the equivalent of Marshall plans to go with the military victories, to complement the military side of the strategy.
Right. Yeah, I think that I would agree with that. And I would say that the Senate Intelligence Committee investigations on enhanced interrogation, and this is even like the result of Pentagon inquiries into this, is that enhanced interrogation has increased support for terrorism. It was not a necessarily effective tool for countering terrorism. And we also created a worldwide torture regime beyond the reach of the U.S. justice system that harmed our alliances, with our European partners. That is something that was pointed to in the field in Iraq and Afghanistan and around the world as undermining America's values and undermining support for our policies, our soft power, our diplomacy. So that's a critical issue, and it's definitely not a knock on the operatives in the field. That is a policy problem emanating from Washington.
Yeah, so again, I'm not going to take a pot shot at JSOC. I think, you know, thinking about the way in which we run operations, I mean, you know, we're very good at hunting terrorists, and we're very good at trying to minimize collateral damage when we can. But that does not mean, in JSOC type of operations, that does not mean that that's all we do, right? When you think about the kind of intelligence side of things, and you think about kind of the bleeding between Title 10 and Title 50, and you're saying, okay, well, the CIA is doing all these types of things, the CIA is engaging in drone strikes. The CIA doesn't have the constraints built around it in the laws of armed conflict that, say, the Air Force does, right? So there's you know, the right hand and the left hand sometimes are doing different things, and it's causing problems. So I think in that sense, you know, that's the only thing I could say operationally that has kind of been a breeding ground for our counterterrorism strategy is that Title 10, Title 50 problem, the gray zone, right? And then what I would also say is that, you know, what we, you know, as a good political scientist, getting my PhD from poli-sci here at CU, I will tell you that, you know, what we know is that when you start engaging in basically carpet bombing or torturing or anything like this, it doesn't weaken the resolve of your enemy. It hardens it. Right? It actually acts as a recruiter, and it hardens the resolve. And so that's, you know, lesson learned. So you don't really want to have this kind of just blanket policy to just do mass amounts of harm in this way, because it's not going to end well. The other thing, too, is I would say is that, you know, following on Joe's comment about Afghanistan, if we had just stopped there, right? This is something that from a policy perspective, from a grand strategy perspective, for the last 70 years in this country, we have had a really bad run of things because we increasingly engage in mission creep that turns into regime change, right? And so instead of saying, I'm going to go after this limited objective, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to get out. No, what we say is I'm going to engage in this limited objective, and then he's got to go, right? And it's usually always a he, right? He's got to go. And once you say he, whoever he is, has to go, then this nation-building thing comes into play. And we haven't been very good at Marshall planning since Japan and Germany, right? And so I think that we have to be really careful about kind of these overexpansive strategies of regime change when we're talking about a fundamental problem of ideology and infrastructure. Thank you.
Just to be provocative, I will take a pot shot at JSOC. And it's not so much at JSOC as tactical and short-term thinking that sometimes dominates our considerations on counterterrorism issues. In the fall of 2014, the U.S. military gets an order. You will go and you will destroy ISIS. And so, okay, they look around. How are we going to do this? We can bomb the smithereens out of them. But that won't actually defeat them. We need ground troops. Okay, we don't want to provide ground troops. Our European allies don't want to provide ground troops. Our Arab friends don't want to provide ground troops. Turkey isn't interested in providing ground troops. The ones that present themselves on offer would be the Syrian Kurds. Maybe that made sense. The Syrian Kurds make up about 10 or 12, 15% of the Syrian population. They are not widely loved by the Syrian Sunni Arab majority. That's about 70% of the population of that country. And they are dominated politically by an entity that is allied with a virulently anti-Turkish terrorist movement that's been operating for the last 35 years and accounted for 42,000 or so deaths in Turkey. There were good reasons to ally with those people. Countless American lives were saved in the battle against ISIS. ISIS arguably has been destroyed because we allied with those folks. But the longer-term picture of what's going to happen with Syria, we willfully disregarded in 2014. We'll worry about that later. And to some extent, that's a little bit of a military mindset. Well, that's tomorrow's problem. We're not going to worry about that now. And that is, today, we can see was a catastrophic problem. It could have been managed in a whole variety of ways, including in ways that still involved allying with Syrian Kurds, but that's not the way it was done. And that's sort of sometimes short-term myopic thinking, not strategic, long-term, big thinking that kind of gets us in the mess. The other point I'd make, we, for better or worse, we decided to go into Afghanistan and Iraq. We needed to make them work, and we didn't. And that fact continues to haunt us for the reasons we've discussed already.
Thank you.
Can I follow up on that really quickly?
Quickly.
Yeah, so there's something I think there that you said that's underappreciated, which is that we do a lot of training, right? So we don't want to send in our people. We send in advisors, so it's advise and assist, and then we give them training and tools. You can't take training back, right? Like if you teach a man to fish, he always knows how to fish. And so this is something that I think we need to really consider when we do these advising and assisting missions, because it's one thing to say we're going in and then we leave them where they were. It's one thing, and it's a different thing to say we're going to go in and we're going to teach them how to wage war, and then we're going to leave.
Thank you. And we only have about 2 minutes remaining, but I want to get to this one last question. There's a lot of interest in lessons that may be learned from our nuclear threat handling, whether that's escalation or mutually assured destruction, and how we mitigated that may be applicable to dealing with the cyber or the lethal autonomous weapons rising threat. So very briefly, any thoughts?
Arms control. It's not deterrence that's the key here, which has a role here, but it's arms control. There is no reason why we can't control these cyber capabilities with agreed upon international legally verifiable frameworks, just the way we had controls on nuclear weapons, imperfect, chemical weapons, biological weapons, imperfect, but they reduce the threat. This is the lesson you take from this. You got to stop these weapons before you build them. You have to stop this kind of warfare before it takes off, because once this stuff is unleashed, there's no logical fire break. It just keeps going.
I mean, if we look at the realm of academia and deterrence theory, the idea of deterrence theory is that the fear of nuclear retaliation would mitigate the likelihood because you had a mad world. The issue now is that if you have a mad world, then you resort to war in peripheral theaters, which is what Heather was getting to. Maybe that peripheral theater is that cyberspace. Maybe the peripheral theater might be civilian attacks. That might be the peripheral theater within that mad dynamic.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with Joe on the arms control side of things. I mean, I work in disarmament a lot, but and what I would just kind of double down with that is, you want arms control because you want to clamp down on proliferation so that non-state actors and terrorist organizations can't get these kinds of systems. But I would also say that there's no interest right now in regulating in cyber, right? The UNGGE, the group of governmental experts on cyber, just completely disintegrated, right? They couldn't even agree that the UN Charter applies in cyberspace. So that's something really difficult. And because the other thing about these systems, from artificial intelligence to cyber to autonomous weapon systems, is that there are huge incentives for them to be used covertly and with non-attribution in these kind of gray zone wars. And so that's actually like a benefit for some people, Russia. And so so I would say that the idea that that they want to engage in arms control is just, there's no appetite for it. And so that's going to continually be a problem.
I think the most accurate theoretical paradigm from IR to apply to this would be offensive realism, where states constantly seek to maximize their advantage in the international system and are inherently expansionist.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry.
The only thing I'd add, in the darkest days of the Cold War, we found ways to talk to the Soviet Union and to identify areas where our interests overlapped and then work on those, including work on those in ways that ultimately improved U.S.-Soviet relations. We can do that now with Russia and China. It ain't easy, and some of the interstate conflicts that were discussed earlier make it more complicated. We were able to do it in the darkest days of the Cold War.
Okay. Thank you so much. That's
Great.
Agree with all your
You prepared your talks.